Descartes, and Francis Bacon. It was clear to more perceptive minds that among endeavors were the possibilities to achieving greater understanding of the world. What was required to disentangle sense from nonsense was a method. The two chief figures involved in advocating methods of inquiry were Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes. These two thinkers are therefore regarded as the founders of modern philosophy, not least because in describing and applying the methods they advocated, they thereby rejected the assumptions and the theological restrictions that since the Middle Ages had increasingly weighed down the philosophical enterprise. Bacon was an empiricist, Descartes a rationalist in the epistemological sense. Empiricism is the view that all genuine knowledge must either originate in or be testable by experience of the world, and this means sensory experience, such as seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling, aided by the instruments of science, such as telescopes, microscopes, oscilloscopes, etc., that extend the range and power of observation. Rationalism, in the epistemological sense, is the view that genuine knowledge can be attained only by reason, by rational inference from first principles, logical foundations, or self-evident truths. Natural science is the paradigm of knowledge for empiricists. It involves observation and experiment. Mathematics and logic provide the paradigm for rationalists. The conclusions of mathematical and logical thinking are certain, which is what the rationalist argued truth should be. Immanuel Kant later on would reject the opposition between empiricism and rationalism and argued for a synthesis between them, that both experience and thought of the world, and the world as we experience and think about it, arise from the combination of the inputs of experience and the action of the mind upon them, and that neither experience of the world nor the world as we experience it is possible otherwise. Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626. Bacon was a statesman, lawyer, essayist, and philosopher. He had a spectacular career between his admission to Cambridge University at the age of 12 and his fall from high office, probably as a result of political machinations at the age of 60 in 1621. Despite being a busy and ambitious man, he managed to devote time to his great love, the study of philosophy and science. But with the leisure enforced by his fall, he set himself to finish an encyclopedic work encapsulating everything known, together with his theories about how more knowledge can be acquired. It was called the Instauratio Magna, implying a great beginning for a new age of firmly based knowledge. He died before he could finish the project, but one of its influential legacies was a book called The New Atlantis, one of my favorites, published posthumously in 1627. In it, Bacon sets forth his concept of a Solomon's House, or a research institute for collaborative scientific effort, the idea that directly inspired the founders, as they themselves acknowledged, of the Royal Society in London in 1662. Bacon's commitment to the promotion of serious science had the practical aim of improving humanity's lot through increased understanding and control of nature. Contrary to the usual view that he was merely a theoretician of method rather than a practicing scientist, he did engage in hands-on science, constructing a physical system and attempting experiments. It was as the result of an experiment on refrigeration, stuffing a dead chicken with snow to see how long it would last, that he caught a chill and died. His system of physics, geocentric and still owing too much to Aristotle despite his rejection of scholasticism, did not advance matters. He did, however, make two major contributions. One was his advocacy of cooperation in science, as therefore requiring an institutional basis for shared experimentation and the exchange of ideas. The magicians and occultists of his day were secretive, keeping their knowledge to themselves because they did not want others to steal a march on them. Bacon saw that progress requires a collegial endeavor, and he advocated it strongly. Science has proved him right. His second contribution lay in the idea of scientific method itself. He had sketched these ideas in an earlier work called The Advancement of Learning in 1605, and developed them in work for the Instauratio Magna, one part of which, the Novum Organum Scientiarum, had been published in 1620 and was of particular significance. As an empiricist, Francis Bacon argued that science must be based on observation of facts, which underpin the theories that organize and explain them. This view is often caricatured as saying that inquirers should gather observations at random and then find a theory to explain them, but that is not what Bacon meant. The caricature was nevertheless widely believed, even though Sir Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin subscribed to it, and indeed both approved of it. In the second edition of the Principia, Newton wrote, quote, "Hypotheses have no place in experimental philosophy. In this philosophy, particular propositions are inferred from the phenomena and afterward rendered general by induction," end quote. Likewise, Charles Darwin in his autobiography wrote, quote, "It appeared to me that by collecting all facts which bore in any way on the variation of animals and plants under domestication and nature, some light might be thrown on the whole subject. My first notebook was opened in July of 1837. I worked on true Baconian principles, and without any theory collected facts on a wholesale scale," end quote. What Bacon himself meant by his method is much closer to the now standard view that observations are gathered to test an antecedently formulated hypothesis that specifies which of those observations would be relevant to refuting or supporting it. This is set out in the plan of the Instauratio Magna. Quote, "The greatest change I introduce is in the form itself of induction and the judgment made thereby. For the induction of which the logicians speak, which proceeds by simple enumeration, is a futile thing, concludes at hazard, is always liable to be upset by a contradictory instance, takes into account only what is known in ordinary, and leads to no result. Now, what the sciences stand in need of is a form of induction which shall analyze experience and take it to pieces, and by a due process of exclusion and rejection lead to an inevitable conclusion," end quote. This method is explicitly empirical, with observation and experiment as the foundation. It somewhat anticipates what are now known as John Stuart Mill's methods, after Mill's account of induction in his System of Logic, written in 1843. Bacon was alert to skeptical challenges to reliance on sense experience, but he had a reply. "We are to," quote, "receive as conclusive the immediate information of the sense. When well disposed, the information of the sense itself I sift and examine in many ways. For certain it is that the senses deceive, but then at the same time they supply the means of discovering their own errors by experiments. For the subtlety of experiments is far greater than that of the sense itself, even when assisted by exquisite instruments. Such experiments, I mean, as are skillfully and artificially devised for the express purpose of determining the point in question," end quote. A striking feature of Bacon's thinking is that it should be guided by the practical knowledge acquired in crafts and trades, and the experience of builders, butchers, carpenters, farmers, and sailors, of people who know their materials, who know nature itself, who have practical experience of how things work and what can be done with them. In this way, he said, we ensure that the foundation of inquiry is how things are, not how we imagine them to be. Quote, "Of this reconstruction, the foundation must be laid in natural history, and that of a new kind and gathered on a new principle. For first, the object of the natural history which I propose is to give light to the discovery of causes and supply a suckling philosophy with its first food. I mean it to be a history not only of nature free and at large, which she is left to her own course and does her own work her own way, such as that of the heavenly bodies, meteors, earth and sea, minerals, plants, animals, but much more of nature under constraint and vexed. That is to say, when by art and the hand of man she is forced out of her natural state and squeezed and molded," end quote. In insisting on a collaborative empirical method, Bacon was urging something revolutionary in contrast to the long dominance of religious doctrine and a priori reasoning that had governed thought for nearly a millennium before his time. But this approach was not new. It was a recovery of the attitude to inquiry that had inspired the first philosophers of classical antiquity, such as Thales, in relying on observation and reason instead of authority and tradition. Bacon's writing, accordingly, promoted a change of attitude to the nature of knowledge that helped to bring the modern mind to birth. The philosophical and scientific revolution of the 17th century was literally the beginning of the modern mind and the functional dominance of the scientific worldview. The standard view had always been that the ancients were superior in wisdom to later generations, their time seen as a golden age to which later people could only look back with wonder. Later people were right. For a time, much knowledge was lost in what was referred to as the Dark Ages under the hegemony of the Church. Witness how many centuries lay between the Byzantine engineers' knowledge of how to raise the dome of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, built in 537 CE, and Brunelleschi's in Florence, built in 1418 to 1434, held as an engineering marvel. A symptom of this looking back with admiration is that Copernicus's heliocentric model was dubbed the Pythagorean system, signifying that his theory was merely a restatement of something known in antiquity. Bacon did not share the Golden Age view, however. His outlook typified that aspect of the Renaissance which saw itself not merely as rediscovery, but as rebirth, in the real sense of starting afresh. It was, of course, essential for new progress to be possible that inquiry should be free. Because it was still not everywhere free from religious orthodoxy, Bacon found it necessary to argue that it should be, by seeking a way to disentangle philosophy from religion in order that the later would not hamper progress. Part of this task was to combat superstition, religion's natural corollary. Bacon wrote, quote, It was a good answer that was made by one who, when they showed him hanging in a temple a picture of those who had paid their vows as having escaped shipwreck, and would have him say whether he did not now acknowledge the power of the gods, he asked again, But where are they painted that were drowned after their vows? Bacon described blind, immoderate religious zeal as a troublesome and intractable enemy to inquiry. Descartes, 1596 to 1650. The other great advocate of method was Bacon's contemporary René Descartes. While Bacon was in Cambridge, Descartes was in Paris. In applying his method to what he saw as fundamental problems, Descartes raised questions that shaped much philosophical debate in the centuries that followed, questions about skepticism and certainty, the nature of mind and its relations to matter, and the role of reason. In recognition of these achievements and their influence, historians of philosophy have labeled him the father of modern philosophy. Descartes was born at Le Haye, since renamed Descartes in his honor, in Touraine, in France. He trained as a lawyer first, then went to the Netherlands to join the Dutch army in order to study military engineering. This fostered his interest in mathematics, to which he made important contributions. His chief interest was physics. He wished to replace the Aristotelian view of the universe taught by the Church, to which he otherwise remained loyal throughout his life, with that of his own. To prepare the ground for his science, he felt that he needed to settle the question of how we can acquire knowledge and attain the truth. His book on this topic, Meditations on First Philosophy, is the classic text that earned him the father of modern philosophy. Title. There are two parts to Descartes' view about how we can acquire knowledge. One is that inquiry should consist in small, cautious steps, from one clear idea to the next, each step carefully reviewed until the chain of reasoning is complete. The other consists in ensuring that the starting point of the chain is unquestionably certain. To achieve this certainty, Descartes famously employed a method of doubt. The first principle of his method is, quote, never to accept anything for true which I did not clearly know to be such, and to comprise nothing more in my judgment than what was presented to my mind so clearly and distinctly as to exclude all ground of doubt, end quote. He applied this method to a related set of four basic questions. The first is, quote, what can I know with certainty, end quote. The next two are, quote, what is the constitution of the universe, and what are the relationships between its fundamental constituents, end quote. The last question concerns the existence of a, quote, good God, end quote, because Descartes needed the concept of such a thing to help with the answer to the first question. As often happens in philosophy, the answer to the first question determined the answers to the others. The, quote, method of doubt, end quote, proceeds as follows. Even if I doubt everything I normally take myself to know or believe, I cannot doubt that I exist. This is the starting point of certainty. This argument, seemingly so simple and direct, is Descartes' celebrated cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He then immediately asks, what is this thing that I know with certainty exists, this me or I? He replies that a little reflection shows that I am a mind or thinking thing, even if I do not have a body, because it is possible to doubt that one has a body. But how can one get from knowledge, however certain, that I exist as a thinking thing to there being anything other than me? Most importantly, an external world and other selves. Descartes needs something to carry certainty beyond the starting point of the cogito. He finds it in the idea that there is a good God. The qualification good is important here, because a good God would not wish us to be deceived if we correctly use the faculties that the God has given us. A bad deity would doubtless take pleasure in deceiving us. Descartes accordingly offers proofs of the existence of such a deity, and correlatively argues that the errors we are prone to fall into are to be blamed not on the deity, but on our own post-fallen nature. Note that Descartes' method of doubt turns crucially on setting aside any belief or claim to knowledge which admits of the least doubt, however improbable or absurd that doubt might be. The aim is to see what, if anything, is left behind once he has called into question everything it is possible to question. Whatever is left will be absolutely certain. It would take impossibility long to subject each individual belief to scrutiny one by one, so Descartes needed a wholly general method of setting aside what can be doubted. This he did by employing the arguments of the skeptic. His use of skeptical arguments does not make him a skeptic. On the contrary, he used the arguments merely as heuristics, as aids in setting up his theory of knowledge. Let's see. Alrighty. He therefore merits the label methodological skeptic rather than problematic skeptic, by which later term is meant anyone who thinks that skepticism poses a real threat to the acquisition of knowledge. Most philosophers since Descartes' time have felt that he did not provide an adequate answer to the skeptical doubts he raised, and that therefore skepticism really is a problem. The first skeptical consideration Descartes uses is a reminder that our senses sometimes lead us astray. Perceptual misjudgments, illusions, and hallucinations can and not infrequently do give us false beliefs. This might prompt us at the very least to be curious in placing confidence on sense experience as a source of truth. But even so, there would be many things I believe on the basis of my current experience, such as that I have hands and I am holding a book in them, that I am sitting in an armchair, and the like. To doubt this would seem to be madness, even given the sense's frequent unreliability. Would it really be mad to doubt such things? No, says Descartes, and here he brings his second argument into play. For I sometimes dream when I sleep, and if I am now dreaming that I am sitting in an armchair holding a book, my belief that I am doing so is false. To be certain that I am sitting thus, I have to be able to exclude the possibility that I am only dreaming that I am doing so. How is that to be done? It seems impossible to do it. But even if one were asleep and dreaming, one would still know that, for example, 1 plus 1 equals 2. Indeed, there are many such beliefs that could be known to be true even in a dream. So Descartes introduces an even more complicated situation and consideration. Suppose that instead of there being a good God who wishes us to know the truth, there is by contrast an evil demon whose whole purpose is to deceive us about everything, even about 1 plus 1 equals 2, and all other such apparently indubitable truths. If there were such a demon, one would have a completely general reason for doubting everything that can be doubted. And now we can ask, suppose that there is such a demon, is there any belief left that I cannot doubt? Is there anything that the demon could not fool me about? And the answer is yes, there is something that is absolutely secure against doubt or deception. It is the proposition that I exist. This is certain because if I think that I exist, or even if I ask whether or not I exist, or even if I think anything at all, the mere fact of my doing so by itself proves that I exist. I could not be tricked by a demon to thinking I exist if I did not exist. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. That is the indubitable starting point Descartes sought. So Descartes thought that he doubted, therefore he existed. Some critics of this method have argued that the skeptical arguments used by Descartes do not work. They are just not credible. How can I doubt that I am now awake? How can one take seriously the idea of an evil demon seeking to trick me about anything and everything? Surely we would not know what we meant by talk of dreams or being deceived unless we understood the contrast with waking or being right, which would seem to require that we sometimes know we are awake or are not being deceived. So Descartes' method of doubt cannot even get started. But these criticisms are misplaced. There is no need for the skeptical arguments to be plausible. They are simply an heuristic, which helps us to see how saying I exist cannot be doubted. It must always be true when one says it. A vulnerability in Descartes' method is that it turns out not to be sufficient by itself, because it requires a guarantee for the reliability of what we take to be clear ideas and careful steps. He claims that this required guarantee is, as already mentioned, the goodness of a deity. His two arguments in the Meditations for the existence of a God purport to establish that it is the required kind of God, indeed the God of revealed religion, an omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good being. Descartes obviously believes in God. The first of these arguments relies on an idea found in Neoplatonism, that the cause of anything must have at least as much and usually more reality than its effect. The argument is that I have the idea of a perfect and infinite being. Since I am imperfect and finite, I cannot be the cause of this idea. Therefore, the idea must be caused in me by something that has at least as much reality as the objective content of the idea, that is, the thing existing outside my mind represented by the idea. And that can only be the perfect and infinite being itself, namely God. So here we see Descartes is mostly using the theories of Plato's forms and Neoplatonism. The second argument is a version of the ontological argument made famous by St. Anselm. It runs as follows. There is a being which is the most perfect being there is. A most perfect being which exists is more perfect than one that does not exist. Therefore, the most perfect being necessarily, that is, essentially, of its essence, exists. Neither argument works, however. His successors in the tradition of philosophy did not find themselves able to think as he did about this matter, and he is therefore alone in saying that we can get from the contents of our minds to a world outside of our heads, because our inferences from the former to the latter, if responsibly drawn, he grants that our fallen natures can lead us into error, can be relied upon with the help of what he calls divine goodness. The second major talking point in Descartes' philosophy, the mind-body problem, is the source of an important debate in philosophy, and more laterally also in psychology and the neurosciences. What is mind, and what is the relation of mind to the rest of nature? How should we best understand such mental phenomena as belief, desire, intention, emotion, and memory? How does the gray matter of the brain give rise to conscious experience and to the vivid phenomenology of color, sound, texture, taste, and smell? Descartes gave the mind-body problem an especially sharp focus by arguing that everything that exists in the world falls under the heading either of material substance or of mental substance, where substance, as noted earlier in Aristotle's metaphysics, is a technical term meaning the or a most basic kind of existing stuff. Descartes defined the essence of matter as extension, that is, occupancy of space, and the essence of mind as thought. Matter is thus extended substance. Mind is thinking substance. The idea that mind and matter are really distinct things is supported by another Descartes' significant claims. Quote, the fact that I can clearly and distinctly understand one thing apart from another is enough to make me certain that the two things are distinct. End quote. By making matter and mind essentially different, he raised the seemingly insuperable problem of how they interact. How does a bodily event like pricking one's finger result in the mental event of feeling pain? How does the mental event of thinking it's time to get up cause the bodily event of rising from the bed? Descartes at first proposed the unsatisfactory answer that mind and matter somehow interact in the pineal gland located in the midbrain, but his successors saw through the ploy. It merely hid the problem in a then mysterious object whose main claim to be the mind-matter interface was its convenient location in the brain. They therefore had to resort to their own heroic solutions to the problem. Their strategy was to accept dualism, but to argue that mind and matter do not in fact interact, their appearance of doing so being the result of the hidden action of God. But such were the views of Malebranche and Leibniz. Malebranche thought that there was in fact no interaction, but that the deity provided correlates for mental and physical events whenever they were required. Obviously, this doctrine is known as occasionalism and is obviously false. Leibniz likewise thought that interaction does not occur, and that God had set the mental and physical realms going at the beginning of time in exact parallel with one another, so that it looks as though mind and matter interact. This is therefore known as parallelism, and it comes at the price of commitment to a rigidly strict determinism, for without it the parallels between the two realms break down. Obviously, Leibniz's view is false. Other philosophers since the time of Descartes and his immediate successors, so as Malebranche and Leibniz, indeed the majority of them think that the only plausible alternative to dualism is a form of monism, mono meaning one. All forms of monism consist in the view that there is only one substance. There are three main possibilities. One is that there is only matter. The second is that there is only mind. The third, that there is a neutral substance, which gives rise to both matter and mind. Each of the three had its proponents, but it is the first option, the reduction of all mental phenomena to matter, which has been the most influential and the most correct. In the end, Descartes himself never arrived at a satisfactory way of dealing with the problem whose deep intractability he had exposed. When pressed by Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia to explain how mental and physical phenomena interact, he ended by frankly acknowledging that he had no answer. It is worth mentioning in passing that the cogito argument was not invented by Descartes. St. Augustine in the early 5th century CE wrote that we can doubt everything except that we doubt, and even he probably did not think he was saying anything novel. Neither, presumably, did Jean de Silhan, whose book The Two Truths was published in 1626 and contained the sentence, quote, "It is not possible for a man who has the ability which many share to look within himself and judge that he exists, to be deceived in this judgment and not exist." End quote. Descartes knew of Silhan's work, which predates his own version of the cogito by at least 5 years. He drafted his discourse on method in about 1630, though it was not published until 1637. For he writes approvingly of Silhan's book, though he does not quote it. Indeed, Descartes owes more than the cogito argument to Silhan. In the passage where the latter states a version of the argument, he also says that a proof of God's existence can be constructed from one's own existence, a vital step for Descartes' program. Descartes' views shaped a great deal of the philosophy that followed. His starting point in the theory of knowledge, that we might begin from the private data of consciousness, from which a route to an external world has to be underpinned by a guarantee of certainty, lest it be an illusion created by perceptual or ratiocinative error, was accepted by all Western philosophy until the 20th century, and it was the source of endless difficulty. So was his dualistic commitment to the real distinction between mind and body, for although Descartes labored, most notably in the Meditations, to provide a guarantee for the route from private experience to knowledge of a public world, few, if any, of his successors could accept what he offered as the solution to that problem.